Winston Irvine is a figure whose name conjures deep contradictions within Northern Ireland's complex political and paramilitary tapestry. His life and actions have sparked debate, suspicion, and controversy over many years. Despite being caught with a significant cache of weapons, his legal outcomes have consistently raised eyebrows. Irvine's story embodies the tensions between the legacy of paramilitary violence, the attempts at peace building, and the murky intersections of power and influence that still permeate Northern Irish society. Winston Irvine was arrested in possession of a boot containing 3 substantial weapons, an offence that would typically warrant a lengthy prison sentence. However, what stood out in his case was the unusually lenient punishment he received. Rather than serving the full minimum sentence, the court described him using the term extraordinary, a characterization that justified reducing his time significantly. In the end, Irvine served just about 15 months in prison, roughly half the minimum sentence and then half again. This leniency was extraordinary, given the severity of the charges. It is important to note that Irvine's sentencing was heavily influenced by references submitted to the court on his behalf. These references were unusual not only for their nature, but also for the prominence of the individuals who authored them. Some of these letters praised Irvine's involvement in reconciliation efforts and his role in the decommissioning process related to the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, the loyalist paramilitary group to which he was linked. The references for Irvine were so significant that they were kept out of the public eye until they were obtained under Freedom of Information laws through an application made by journalist Sam McBride. The contents of these letters revealed a network of endorsements from notable figures. Among those who wrote in his favour were Harold Good, a minister, Jim Ruddy, a veteran of reconciliation work, Karen McAvoy, an academic from Queen's University, and David Campbell, a former advisor to the Ulster Political Research Group and chair of the Loyalist Communities Council. Additional letters came from individuals such as Conor Burns, a former Conservative minister, highlighting Irvine's role in reconciliation work at Lambeth Palace. Importantly, the references explicitly stated Irvine's involvement in the UVF's commissioning process, a role that could only be fulfilled by an actual member of the UVF. These testimonies suggested that Irvine was not only a member of the UVF, but also an important figure in the organization's attempts to transition away from violent paramilitary structures. This raised a major question. If it was clear to many that Irvine was deeply embedded in the UVF, why did official channels continue to deny or avoid publicly acknowledging his paramilitary status? This contradiction between public silence and private knowledge fueled frustration and suspicion among observers and critics. Irvine's identity as a UVF member has long been known to journalists and security officials, though never officially admitted. Journalist Peter Taylor famously named Irvine as a UVF man in a Spotlight program broadcast about 10 to 15 years ago, and Irvine never contested this public assertion. Over the years, several incidents further linked him to the UVF. His house was found to contain UVF paraphernalia, including a balaclava, emblems, and plaques associated with the group. Despite this, these pieces of evidence were dismissed by some as insignificant or irrelevant. The argument was that anyone could have such items, thus denying any definitive connection to paramilitary activity. However, for many, this dismissal seemed disingenuous, given the broader context of his actions, references, and reputation. Winston Irvine's story cannot be understood without reference to the post-Good Friday Agreement context. The peace agreement, signed in 1998, sought to end decades of conflict by supporting the decommissioning of weapons and facilitating the transition of paramilitary groups away from violence. Substantial funds were made available by the British and Irish governments to support this transition process, often channeled through community projects and reconciliation initiatives. Irvine's role seemed to sit at the intersection of paramilitary activity and this peace-building framework. His references often highlighted his involvement in efforts to steer the UVF away from military structures and into a more peaceful role within the community. However, critics argue that this process was, and remains, problematic, with large amounts of money potentially being funneled to paramilitary groups as part of this transition without a clear end date or accountability. This situation risks being perceived as legalized extortion or a form of bribery, where paramilitary leaders receive funding to maintain peace, but the cycle of influence and control remains unbroken. Irvine's influence extended beyond the paramilitary and political spheres into the everyday lives of the communities affected by this legacy. He, along with others in similar positions, acted as gatekeepers, controlling access to social and community projects, especially those related to youth and women's services. Essentially, to work within these loyalist communities, organizations and individuals needed his approval or support. This gatekeeper role meant that the same figures linked to paramilitary structures could dominate and control funding and social initiatives, complicating efforts to build trust and genuine community development. While some independent groups like the Falls Women's Center and the Shankill Women's Center managed to operate effectively and independently, others were caught up in the dynamics controlled by people like Irvine. Winston Irvine's relationship with the UVF was not without tension. Reports indicate that there was an internal investigation within the UVF regarding Irvine's activities. He was accused of duplicity, telling different stories to the UVF leadership and to outside parties, including government representatives. For example, after a significant bomb attack attributed to the UVF's North Belfast company, Irvine met with Irish government officials, blaming the attack on renegade loyalists rather than the UVF itself. This behavior, which appeared unauthorized and secretive, coupled with suspicions that he was pocketing money from rackets without informing others, created significant internal strife. Despite living a comfortable lifestyle, which some viewed as suspicious given his paramilitary ties, he managed to avoid significant legal consequences. This situation has fed speculation about the protection he may have received from certain authorities and the resulting erosion of public trust. The controversies surrounding Irvine have deeply damaged public confidence in policing and justice systems. When questioned at a police board meeting, Deputy Chief Constable Bobby Singleton made it clear that while Irvine and his associates had been arrested under terrorism legislation, the police had done their job. The failures, he implied, lay elsewhere, perhaps in the public prosecution service or in political decisions. This case stands in stark contrast to how dissident Republicans or individuals involved in lesser offenses have been treated, often harshly and with restrictive conditions. The perception that Irvine was untouchable has added to the sense of injustice felt by many communities, deepening skepticism about equal application of the law. Currently, Winston Irvine is serving time in Magaberry Prison, Northern Ireland's highest security facility. He is housed on the Loyalist wing, but has been moved away from the main UVF section, a development that signals his falling out with the organization. Without UVF protection, his safety inside and outside prison could be at risk, although there are debates about whether he should remain on the Loyalist wing for his own security or face isolation to prevent any further influence he may have. Given the short amount of time he has left to serve, the implications for his future are complex. His fall from favor within the UVF might mark the end of his political and paramilitary influence, but the long-term impact of his actions and the controversies around him will continue to reverberate through Northern Irish society. Winston Irvine's story encapsulates many of the contradictions and complexities of Northern Ireland's post-conflict reality. A man linked publicly and privately to one of the most notorious loyalist paramilitary groups, Irvine benefited from a legal and political system that appeared willing to accommodate him due to his perceived role in the peace process. Yet this accommodation came at a cost, fueling suspicion, undermining public trust, and raising difficult questions about the limits of justice and reconciliation. His role as a gatekeeper controlling access to funding and projects, the internal UVF conflicts, and his public persona all point to a figure who embodies the tensions of a society still grappling with the legacy of its past. Whether Irvine's story will be a cautionary tale or a catalyst for deeper reform remains to be seen. But his case remains a stark example of how difficult peace and justice can be to balance in post-conflict Northern Ireland. That is it for today's video. What is your thoughts on our story? And leave a comment below, and I will see you next time.